Good evening. Welcome to the 17th edition of the COA Social Reads talk today. We are glad to have architect Dikshu Kukreja with us to talk about the practice of CP Kukreja architects and the book Archiving 50 Years of Practice. We thank architect Habib Khan and the president and the council for supporting the series actively. And over the last 2 years, we have managed to archive some of the most significant practices in India and across the world. So, Architect Dikshu's talk today would address 5 decades of India's built environment, a book published by Rowley Books and authored by architect Dikshu Kukreja and Arunima Kukreja. The book captures the transformations that have taken place through the lens of a leading multidisciplinary architecture and engineering practice of CP Kukreja architects based in Delhi and with studios in several other countries. Architect Dikshu Kukreja is the managing principal of CPKA New Delhi, a premier multidisciplinary architectural and engineering organization based in Delhi. CPKA is ranked among the top 100 architecture firms in the world and top 5 in Asia. Architect Dikshu Kukreja received his B.Arch as a gold medalist from SPA New Delhi. He attended the prestigious Taliesin Fellowship at Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture in USA and received his Masters of Architecture and Urban Design from the prestigious Harvard University. We hope we can have another dialogue inviting Harvard sometime down in June or July. The co-authors architect Arunima Kukreja, who has been a student of history honors from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, and holding a diploma in environmental law. Arunima is an ardent writer and interior designer and philanthropist who heads the CPKA Foundation for Design Excellence, which promotes consciousness in design cutting across genres. So thank you, Architect Dikshu Kukreja, for participating in this forum. And we look forward to your presentation on the book, which archives a journey of 50 years. And then maybe after that, we could engage or immerse ourselves in a small dialogue on, there are quite a few questions also that the young architects and the architects participating are posting on YouTube, which we will bring into the dialogue at the end. So do join us to welcome Architect Dikshu Kukreja presenting on the practice and the book.
Well, good evening and maybe good afternoon and good morning to other parts of the world where people are joining in from. But first and foremost, thank you so much, Mr. Balsavar, for initiating such an interesting concept. As far as I know, this concept has been an ongoing one, but initiating it with myself, I'm very happy to be here. And I must also compliment the Council of Architecture for actually having conceived this kind of a program, which allows not just a live interaction with people who have an interest in architecture, but also leading to, as you were explaining me, if for posterity, a sort of an archive, which will allow people to understand design practices and design approach of these practices. So I'm very happy to be here. And I do feel that it is an opportunity to engage with people who have a passion for architecture, who have an interest in seeing how our built environment begins to impact our physical environment. And for that matter, I would even say vice versa. So let me just run through a presentation which captures some images, some glimpses of this book, which I have co-authored with Arunima Kukreja on 5 decades of India's built environment. And then, yes, I look forward to the questions that follow and enticing conversation with you. So architecture, I feel, is one such unique art form which transcends over time and has a visible impact on the physical environment. It is therefore important to establish certain moments in history to observe these transformations in architecture over that period of time, or probably a certain phase. My co-author Arunima Kukreja and I decided to pick one such moment in time to study the last 5 decades of India's built environment through the lenses of an architectural practice, which is CP Kukreja Architects. And this moment assumes importance, not just because it is marking a milestone in the journey of a particular architecture firm, but I think it also in many interesting ways coincides with a certain milestone that independent India is celebrating, and that is our 75 years of our independence. So I think it's interesting from an architect's perspective to see how a certain firm's work over this kind of a time period vis-a-vis what has been transforming in our country over these last 5 decades, how the two sort of correlate and how one influences the other. So this document, CP Kukreja Architects, the 5 decades of India's built environment, really takes us through these periods starting from the early 70s and how each decade had an influence on the architectural responses that were getting created and responding to the moments in time in that period. The 70s had its own distinct time and journey and challenges for the country. Similarly, it followed in the decades that came about, each one having its own unique period. But before we get into 70s, if we were to just backtrack a little bit and see what happened really when the independent India came into existence. And that moment coincided with a very, very important marker in world history. And that was when the partition took place. And with that partition, it also led to what was in history of the world, the greatest displacement that would have ever taken place in humanity. And this is the kind of displacement that happened between what became then 2 nations and how suddenly India was faced with a situation where we had come together as one country, but with very, very diverse cultures, with very different, I mean, there were innumerable provinces, innumerable regions which had suddenly come together and formed one nation, and a nation which had a large population, but very little resources. And through that, I think those next 2.5 decades, coming close to 70s, was really about India standing on its feet as a young country, young independent nation. And there were challenges that India was meeting, not so much about architectural styles or large projects, but really it was about just fighting famine, fighting floods, fighting poverty, and just providing a roof over heads of many who had suddenly come into this country, displaced from another part of what used to be, what now is, of course, Pakistan. But from there, when we come into the 70s, we realize that the country was now beginning to go through another phase. And this phase, on the one side, the economy or the politics was taking center stage in terms of a certain nationalization or a national movement that was coming about. But also with this, what was coming about was a need now for the nation to lay focus on education and creating institutions. And that is a very important period in the history of independent India. And one such important moment which took place in this phase was the creation of a very important university, which was named, of course, after our first Prime Minister, the Jawaharlal Nehru University, which stands today right there in the capital, in the heart of this, in Delhi, and occupies a large area of 1,000 acres. So at that time, of course, this was a project which was about creating a new kind of thinking. It was about creating a certain liberal education that the country had not yet seen really in a large scale. It was about creating an educational institution which would be of world standard And for India to have those kind of dreams and aspirations was a very bold move at that moment. And from that point of view, how does the architecture of such a university, how does the architecture reflect the aspirations of the university or its mission? And here, the architectural response became what has really, in many ways, then led to a certain movement. And that is about tropical regionalism. It's about contextual architecture. So this was a national competition which took place. And at that time, Mr. C.P. Kukreja, who really ran a very small two-man practice out of a garage, he took part in this competition. And a young man in his early 30s, he actually went ahead and won this big national competition and was faced with what was suddenly one of the most prominent projects in the country. And in this project, he brought about, or he strived to bring about, a new direction for modern independent India. And that was about what today has become the talking point in not just in India, but globally. It was about sustainability. It was about creating an architecture which belonged to India, but was not just rooted in its history or its culture, but I mean historical aspects. But it was also about searching for new roots and meanings about a new modern India. So it was about bringing these two very diverse ideas and creating built forms out of that, and all with the intention of creating sustainable design. So if you see these buildings, which were built in the 70s, almost 50 years ago, these are using natural materials such as brick. They are about deep overhangs, recesses. They are about windows or glazings which bring in heat with adequate protection. And we are talking about a time when really air conditioning and other engineering technologies were really not so popular, or rather in many cases, some of these technologies were even non-existent or at least unaffordable. And JNU, why it is even talked about today is because it set a new meaning for education in India. It was one of the first campuses which took a departure. It made a departure from what was that time a rather standard approach in designing of educational institutions, which is where really students and faculty were considered two distinct elements or entities in a campus, and therefore their physical presence, their housing, their other facilities were always considered to be really kept away from each other. This was the first time where an approach was made of creating literally a modern village, inspired by Indian villages, inspired by the idea of coexistence. This master plan started talking about bringing students and faculty in close proximity to each other. So it created these distinct enclaves, and each enclave was planned with 600 student housing and 150 faculty residences, all coming together to plan for 10,000 students. And all the topography of this site, which is very distinct, it has sunken areas, it has undulating areas, it has rocky outcrops. All these really became a reason to celebrate the site. And as a result, you have distinct forested areas, you have water bodies which have been conserved and actually made part of the overall system of surface drainage of this site. So all these elements came together to become an architecture which was very contextual, very responsive to the site. And considering the tropical architecture of Delhi, which of course today has really become more hot and arid, it was about creating these kind of pergolas, creating these walkways which would encourage students to move from one academic building to another. Because this campus was also more about multidisciplinary learning, which has become more popular today in the last decade or decade and a half. But this was conceived and imagined at that time, 50 years ago, that that's the way education should be. And it was about creating these microcosm of climatic responses. So the idea of pergolas, which create shadows on the building. It was about second layers of buildings by creating colonnades. It was about creating small scalable courtyards, which become breathing elements to a campus. Then you had buildings such as this. This was one of India's first computer centers to come up in this country. And at that time, when this building came up in early 70s, it was the cost of a computer literally was matching the cost of a building. That's how scarce a computer technology was in India. And therefore, when in Delhi or many parts of India were frequented with power outages, how do you create an architecture or a building which can house that computer, but will have very less heat in-gain or thermal heat in-gain into the interiors of the building? So that's how these deep overhangs again and these protective layers on the building became design tools. Moving from the 70s, we come into another era, another period of the 80s. And here there was the movement that was taking place in the country was where we had begun to establish not just educational and other institutions, as I mentioned in the 70s, but also that period of the 70s was about townships, about public sector companies like IFCO, CRIPCO, large government bodies setting up their own industries and their own industrial townships. It moves into a period of 80s where we also started searching for a cultural identity. That was a period that started coming up in the country where institutions, more in the search of a cultural identity, also emerge on the built map of our cities. One such project was the Karmapa International Buddhist Institute, also sometimes popularly known as the Rumtek Monastery. The Rumtek Monastery, of course, the original monastery is in Sikkim. And here, this piece of land was given by the government of India to Dalai Lama because at that time, foreign nationals were not permitted to travel to Sikkim. So as an alternative of Buddhist learning, this institute or this piece of land right in the heart of Delhi, in South Delhi, of 5 acres was given to Dalai Lama to establish an institute of Buddhist learning. Now, for that kind of an institute, the physical environment or the architectural response had to be something where even if somebody cannot visit Sikkim, they are able to absorb that feel. They are able to get a sense of not just that physical environment of what the Rumtek Monastery holds in Sikkim, but also that sense of learning. How do you do that with trying to bring a visible architecture from that region, from that culture, and bring it into India, into Delhi, which has its own climatic concerns, which has its own kind of material choices. So while most of the buildings in Delhi were built in brick and concrete at that time, and out there in Sikkim, the monastery is built in timber, this building, built again in brick and concrete, is able to capture the kind of a sense of timber architecture, the kind of motifs, the kind of artwork, the kind of detailing which the Rumtek Monastery has back in Sikkim. And this project was, and this is an era we are talking about where computers were, or AutoCAD was still not existent, at least here in India. And how do you create those kind of drawings? How do you create this kind of architecture through the skilled labor that you have, which is used to doing a very different kind of architecture here in North India? So for this, first, the architects spent time, considerable time of a month sitting there and researching and documenting what Buddhist architecture is like in the mountains in the Northeast. And then from there, the architects worked very closely with artisans who were brought in from Sikkim, and they were close to 500 artisans who were brought in here, and that architecture, that vernacular was then, the attempts were made to successfully bring about that architecture in its response here in Delhi. So this is how the building even stands today, reflecting the colors, the vibrancies, the detailing, and the architecture of Rumtek. And these, so the same programmatic elements of prayer halls and housing for the monks and other students. So a monastery, for those who might not be so familiar with it, literally is like a university. It is an institution of learning. And just the way in a university you go through various degree programs, even in a monastery, based on the time that you spend in learning here, you go through different levels of graduation. or achieving different degrees of based on your learning. So this is how the monastery has been, the Karmapa International Buddhist Institute has been created here in Delhi. Again, as I say, a cultural response to a social condition of the 1980s which was prevalent in India. Moving from that came another milestone in India's history, and which had a very strong influence to in the architecture which was to follow in the 90s. And this is, of course, when in 1991, India's economy became more liberated, and we embraced globalization. And with that came in many multinational companies which started coming into India. There were many products which came in. There were many building products which came in, many technologies which started, construction technologies which started coming in. So how do you respond in terms of architecture when that is what is sweeping the nation or the conditions around you? One such project which took place in that period from the CPKA studio was of Ambadeep Towers. And this is a project which is a commercial building, as they would call it, a developer-based building right there in downtown of Delhi, in the heart of the central business district of Connaught Place, that you create a building which is driven by what typically commercial projects tend to be, which are FARs and ground coverages and all these other statutory norms. But how do you reflect a modern India and yet try to keep it rooted in its legacy or in its repertoire of culture and context? So this building, the architecture or the urban form emerged first with the physical context of the site. Now, if we see a lot of buildings in Connaught Place which were built leading to this period of the mid-90s were buildings which were more orthogonal volumes, which were in a way still in some ways emulating modern architecture, and literally became these orthogonal volumes placed one next to the other. How do you create a departure from that? And why do you first of all need to create a departure? The departure here, the need arises from the need to be more contextually responsive and more culturally responsive. So because this site is at the crossroads of two very important roads in the city, the Kasturba Gandhi Marg and the Tolstoy Marg, the idea was to create a more public space. So the crossroads of the city have been responded to by creating a public plaza, rather than just having a volume which comes all the way down here and blocks that site or the corner. It creates a public plaza here. Then the second thing to do is that if you want to have that much built volume or FAR, how do you do that? So the volume that has been removed from here is sculpted out and is actually placed on top here. So it's the same orthogonal volume, but it makes a departure in the urban form, in the built form. And as a result, it starts having this kind of a volumetric display where different parts of the building stop at a different height. And that is in turn driven by another statutory norm, which is about creating refuge areas. So at the levels that the codes mandate to create refuge area is where a terrace gets created. And that's how the volumetric disposition takes place. Another important element in this project was about how do you give back to the common man? How do you create an architecture which is relevant also to the common man? So for a lot of us, when we observe Delhi from a certain plane, we suddenly are pleasantly surprised to see how green our city is. The crowns of trees that sort of hide a lot of the built environment which exists below these trees is a sudden revelation which you otherwise don't realize when you're walking or driving in this city. So for the common man to enjoy this very unique experience of his city, the idea was to create glass elevators. So one of the first, amongst the first buildings to come up in Delhi, which has glass elevators, is Ambadeep. It has these 3 elevators. So as somebody who needs to come in as a visitor to this building, he needs to come and visit any of these offices, he can take this elevator and has panoramic views, surprised probably for the first time ever in his life, his or her life, he sees his city from this kind of a elevation. The other important aspect that this building tried to do was about creating a sense of scale, a sense of magnificence, but all yet keeping the scale with the human being, and also by bringing in art, because that's one of the things which we have historically, our buildings have always been a fusion of art and architecture. They have never been separated from each other. We can go into any part of our country and look at our buildings, historical buildings. We see the two so closely embedded together. But somewhere again, post-independent India, this thing sort of disappeared or dissolved. And for again art to be brought back, the idea here was to be inspired by our patterns, our geometric patterns, our colors, and create this huge edifice, one of the tallest buildings of Delhi at that time, and created with the smallest atom. And that is a 1 inch by 1 inch glass mosaic tile. And those mosaic tiles go on to create facades which are completely embraced with art and have these kind of patterns and colors. And this is again a building which was done in the pre-AutoCAD era. And this is the kind of art which the entire building then is covered with. Moving on to the next decade is the new millennium. And that is when we enter the period of 2000. And there again was a new feeling that was coming in our country. Of course, we had the IT, we were actually in the midst of the IT boom, and there were, new materials, which were many imported materials, which were beginning to become commonplace in the physical appearance of our cities, whether it was glass buildings or it was ACP or buildings which were now becoming, considered modern, considered contemporary, just because they were being built in metal and steel. So how do you create an architecture which is modern, which talks about modernity, and yet also reflects its context of location, and again is embracing art? So at that period, another development which was happening in India, of course, in the education front, was about IB schools. So from our pattern of CBSE schools, which most of India followed, there was this international baccalaureate program and such institutions which were coming into India. Pathways is one such institution which was conceived in 2002 and was about implementing an IB program. Now, this school is located on the top of Aravali Hills in south of Delhi. And there the idea is, again, that we wanted to create not just an architecture which was about metal or glass, but on the contrary, it was an architecture which was inspired by the local material, which was quartzite stone here on the hill. And also there was a great, a depression on the site. So the idea here is that this depression was converted into a large water body, a lake, but it wasn't left at that. We wanted to take the opportunity of creating this water body also as a work of art. So engaging with the village women from around this area and getting inspiration from the Rangoli patterns that they created. Those Rangoli patterns were then magnified in scale, and then with the broken tiles and broken materials, ceramics that were used in this project, this large pattern was created at the base of the lake, which starts becoming an art form in itself. Otherwise, the material, of course, besides local stone, was brickwork. And again, you see the response is not about metal and steel, but it's about an architecture where you have response to the climate, you create those shadows, and you create recessed windows, and you create, try to reduce the thermal heat gain into the building. Another aspect that was looked at in this project was that how do you inculcate the value of our history, the art, the appreciation of art that young minds should possess? Is it only confined to art classes taking place within studios or classrooms? Or is it something that you can actually bring in sculpture in the campus, and by doing elements in design where you bring in sculptural elements all around the campus, you are able to start making students subconsciously learn and appreciate art. So whether it is using recycled materials, broken tiles on and just putting them on columns, to having artwork, sculptures dotting the entire campus, it's about that kind of an appreciation as well. From there, we move on to the most recent decade, which has concluded, and that is 2010s. And that is from 2010 to 20. And this is again marked with a new transformation that India is going through. And that is about transformation of becoming a country which has a strong global impact, a country which can make a mark globally. It is also a period where we are now talking or hearing a lot about becoming more and more self-reliant, whether it is about government creating policies or environments such as Make in India or Atmanirbhar aspects in the economy. But at a greater level, at a society level, it is about having India playing a most significant role at a global scale. And from there emerged projects such as this project, which is the India International Convention Center, which has been designed again by our studio in association with an international practice, IDOM from Spain. It is about creating a project which is of global scale. It is about meeting the global scale of commerce and business. So this project, which is one of the largest projects coming up in India now, is about creating a convention and exhibition center. But the scale is again, unheard of or unseen in India before. So for example, this building that you see here in the overall view, which has the 6 gray squares, is actually the world's third largest convention center, with a capacity of not 1,000 or 2,000, but a capacity of 10,000. These exhibition halls that you see here, 5 such halls, are massive halls where just the single span is one of the largest in India, of over 250 feet is what the structure is spanning. And these are exhibition halls which become a scale in size from 5 lakh or 500,000 square feet to even larger. So that's the kind of scale. This building, the circular building, is an indoor arena which will house 20,000 people and has a retractable roof. So with this kind of technologies, which now India possesses, this building, the convention center, which I just spoke about, has the world's largest LED facade. But then again, how do you respond to creating semi-outdoor spaces, semi-covered spaces, and not just clustered, internalized spaces? So this design is about a convention center, as one would have seen in many parts of the world, which tend to be large boxes, very internalized spaces. Here, the idea is that those 10,000 people are not just confined to, let's say, the plenary halls, but you create a series of spaces, levels, where people are able to interact even in semi-covered spaces. You create shadows and recesses into the building. You create these kind of large, magnificent, huge steps, which become places where public, again, you have people sitting, people interacting, and that's the kind of scale. This is about how you bring in public transit, again, to make projects like these sustainable designed. Bringing in mass transit. So in this case, you have the metro, underground metro, coming into the heart of this complex. And from that metro, in a multimodal manner, then you take on another means of public transport, which could be monorail, which would take you through across in the entire campus. So how it's about moving from the era of private automobiles, private vehicles, and embracing more sustainable means of transport. It's about creating, about large public spaces which are created in such a complex, which would be having close to 1 million people at a time. It's about creating artwork inspired technology-driven sustainable measures such as solar panels, not just being those black panels that we are all used to seeing now on our rooftops, but about being inspired from Rangoli designs again and creating these kind of photovoltaic panels which are placed on these very, very large rooftops, and then also trying to make these kind of large rooftops into public spaces. I'm going to end here with, let's see what the 20s has to offer to us, but with a project which is being talked about a lot, and I'm happy that it has been able to catch the global attention and at a global stage, which is the ongoing World Expo 2020, which is taking place in Dubai. And in that project, it is about where India has been able to create, again, a large global presence and impact, because India, as the government of India chose to create, build one of the largest pavilions in the entire expo. And there are over 190 pavilions here. And the India pavilion has been chosen the most iconic designed pavilions. So this is again good to see that we are able to showcase not just our history and legacy and culture, but in a very modern interpretive way by a kinetic technology which we have embraced in the design of this building. So I think as we move ahead and we are to only watch what the decades to follow are going to create in terms of our physical environment, I think it's important to see and appreciate that India has gone through a major transformation, not just in the last 75 years, but if we were to talk about its architecture and the influence that we are able to now have on a global scale in the last 5 decades, the transformation that has taken place. I personally feel from an optimistic viewpoint, which I always choose to take, is about how we can really celebrate Indian architecture, take the positive learnings from what Indian architecture has produced in the last 5 decades or post-independence, and really from here on, go on to make not just a mark within our country, but make a global mark, make a global impact. So I'm pleased to share this journey with you. And I hope for those of you who choose to delve into it deeper, would like to go through this book, which Arunima Kukreja and I have authored. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Architect Dikshu Kukreja. I think it's a long journey that spans 50 years. And since you kind of concluded the presentation on the expo and the kind of contemporary predicament that we find ourselves in, could we begin maybe for a moment going back, as for a kind of comparison on the context, the social context, and the kind of studio that was there in the 70s. And there were drawings were made by hand. There was no email or GPS. Everything, drawings traveled by post. So if there were projects in, let's say, other countries or even other cities, I think the drawing may have taken 2 or 3 weeks to reach, unlike the email, which travels real time. And of course, calculations and dimensions, everything was hand done. It was not there was no computer aided system. So if we could briefly from your archives, because I did see a few hand-drawn drawings of the JNU that you had presented, if you could share some aspects from the archives to kind of reveal that time, because I think then it would be a good juxtaposition of the kind of studios we have now, the digitization. And so if that's possible, I think I would invite you to share briefly on that ambience that may have been there in the early 70s.
Of course. I think it's very interesting, and this is what we discovered when we went through this journey of documenting and researching on these, on what CPKA went through in the last 5 decades. So there are certain commonalities which have stood the test of time of these last 5 decades, and there are certain things which actually seem like they were belonging to another era altogether. And I'll explain how. When it comes to hand-drawn drawings, for example, that you said, it's very interesting how, as a firm, as a practice, and as a studio, the idea always was that whatever is being created and being designed should be very carefully emerge out of the context of the site or the context of the urban environment around. And therefore, when we looked into our archives, we found it very interesting to see the amount of documentation and research that was done about a site. Today, we have total station equipment and surveys, which can in a jiffy produce a survey and provide so much information within that survey of a site. But at that time, you didn't have such kind of technology and equipment. Yet, the endeavor in the studio was to really research about the site before you are tempted to quickly find the design solution for the project. So that was one of the things we found very interesting as an approach in the studio of those times. The other aspect was, yes, I actually find it quite surprising and marvel at the concept that back in the 70s, this design practice of CPK was actually working in 13 different countries. And there were projects being done in Tehran and Baghdad and across Middle East Asia. And when you look at it today, and as you just rightly pointed out, how long the drawings would have taken to travel, or how difficult it used to be just for a site visit to be made before the project, and of course during construction. So these things were a lot, I mean, communication. And for that matter, communication with the site, access to projects and what was happening in those projects was not as real time as we can get today. So even with that, to be able to create projects across different 13 different countries, being in a country which itself was yet not exposed to global technologies, global materials, I think in that sense, it's quite impressive and a hard task to match with today. But similarly today, if we are to compare that kind of a thing, I find it very satisfying to see that the same yearning exists in the studio. The people might have changed, a new generation, a new way of thinking is there in the studios. But those philosophies of wanting to go ahead and do something different, wanting to innovate, and innovation is exciting, but never easy. And has a lot of uncertainties attached to it. But the yearning is there, and conscious efforts are made all the time to do that. I think that's an aspect which, if you compare back with the 70s, like you were talking about those hand-drawn drawings, to today, where, you know, we all know where technology has taken us. In fact, we don't know what tomorrow, which technology is going to emerge. But within all that, the studio's vision, aspiration, and way of working and the passion is still very much the same.
Thank you. The next question would be slightly beyond the idea of practice, because if I recollect in the book, there was this idea, and it which kind of materialized also. It was not, didn't remain at the level of an idea, and a desire to set up first a school, a magazine, and a magazine A+D, more because one felt that it needed a platform for discourse. Could you briefly describe this ecosystem of practice? A magazine that today has almost become archival because it has documented over the years, I think since the 80s to now, and the fact that there was a school. Could you kind of share the ecosystem that emerged from these three kind of references?
Sure, absolutely. It's a very good question, because yes, many times, because of the breadth of work that CPK has been engaged in, under that volume, it often goes unnoticed that the approach at CPK, or rather I would say the vision of Mr. CP Kukreja, was beyond just creating another physical entity or a building. It was about looking at architecture at a much broader level. And I have heard many people come up to me and say that, Mr. Kukreja is one of those legends who's the least written about. His projects have not been in the discourse as much as they deserve to be or should be. Now, that's I leave that debate for another day. But the fact is that Mr. Kukreja looked always beyond just designing buildings. So one of the things he felt was that in as large a nation, as diverse a nation that we are, it was strange that we were limiting ourselves to the knowledge of only knowing a handful of architects or architectural firms. And that he felt was somewhere unfair to the talent that existed in this country. So he came up with this idea, and he was able to convince people that there was a need for an architectural discourse and about the need for an architectural magazine. So A+D was one of the probably amongst the first architectural magazines to come up in India. Now, having gained independence in 1947, this magazine came up almost 40 years or 35 years later. So that's the gap that was there in this country, where there was nobody really documenting Indian architecture. And for him, it was not about these handful of architects. Of course, he paid ode to all these legends that in modern Indian architecture had produced. And it was certainly never about celebrating CPK's work there. But it was about celebrating Indian architects from small towns, from other cities, the unknown geniuses that were there in this country. And that's why the need for A+D, which he created, and spent so much of his resources in making sure that such a magazine came. And we all know that when it's the first of its kind, how challenging it can be. And again, we are talking about a non-computerized world when this magazine came into existence. So that was one of his endeavors. Moving on from there, which was in the early 80s or mid 80s, he then felt the need that there was a need to relook at architectural education. How does architectural education, and this emerged from his own philosophy of architecture, not the need to break the silos within Indian architecture. Why does architecture in India have to be practiced only in a silo? Why don't we embrace other disciplines, be it engineering or, more importantly, the arts? And that led to the creation or birth of Sushant School of Art and Architecture. It was Mr. Kukreja's brainchild, and he was able to convince his friends, client, and promoter all in one to really come on board and establish this School of Architecture. And this Sushant School was not a school of architecture. It's been Sushant School of Art and Architecture. And of course, then he brought on board Professor Mansingh Rana. And with Professor Rana's knowledge and inspiration and philosophies of Frank Lloyd Wright and the organic architecture, and the stellar role that Mr. Rana then played in leading that institution, is all something one reminisces now about. But that's the overall approach that CPKA as a studio and Mr. Kukreja in particular felt that he needs to go beyond, or our practice needs to go beyond, and embrace other disciplines and embrace and engage with society more than just in a role of a client and an architect.
Sure. Thank you. That was the kind of ecosystem that we were looking at. There is another, how would you now characterize the present practice, the practices in contemporary times? If we may say, if it's possible, I'm just raising certain thoughts, as a kind of not to compare, but just to juxtapose the 70s. And there was a socialist nuance to the whole practice at that time. I think the book kind of documents that transition between the socialist notion and the kind of projects that emerged, largely state-driven, And the sudden abrupt turn that I think the whole world experienced with what we call today globalization, and the fact that it moved to neoliberal uh, economies, changed the nature of projects. There was a greater need for efficiency. There was a greater need or a focus on the FARs. It was really a sea change, between. So how would you characterize the present? Because I think the book somewhere records this, and I think that's also the time when you joined the practice. There's the next generation coming in, and I'm sure several practices are in the sense confronting uh, similar conditions. They can be facilitative, but they can also be contradictory and paradoxical at the same time, because the environment is such. When the environment around is such, I don't think a practice can not but be influenced by that environment. So the book does record the fact that it began to move stronger. I mean, it began as a two architect or a two-person kind of an office, but I think moved into a very interdisciplinary team. you know so could you elaborate on the nature of this interdisciplinary team within the practice, not outside the practice as a conglomerate, but within the practice? And what were the kind of considerations to evolve such an interdisciplinary team to deal with the challenges of the contemporary? Could you share with us some of these considerations that went in?
Right. So at CPKA, we felt that, we've always felt that architecture is a discipline which has a tremendous impact on society. Many, many times at a very subconscious level, but the impact is still profound. So how do we make sure that this impact that is being made through the buildings that we as architects end up designing, that this impact is in a positive way? And many times, we can make certain assumptions, but only time tells whether, how that impact has been, which side of the spectrum it falls in. But the intention here is very clear, that we want to make sure that we can be as engaged with society as is possible, because that's the only way we think that we can make the right impact. And by all this, I mean that we feel that many times through our observations that architecture is not as well understood by society, by clients, by people around us as much as it should. Now, this is a debate for another day, whether it's the clients to blame or society to blame, or it's we as architects to blame for not having that right communication. But as a practice, we felt that it's important for us to open ourselves, to literally start functioning as sponge, to be able to absorb whatever we see around us, whether it's the financial and economical environment, the culture, the physical context, absorb all of that, and then put on our thinking minds there to create something. So the practice today works in a very, very interdisciplinary manner. For example, when we start a project, we don't look at this being the exclusive domain of only the architects to first start thinking or conceptualizing it, and then after engaging with your client, arriving at something which then engineers have to follow. We take a very interesting approach, for good or bad, but we seem to swear by it, is that architecture should go beyond its boundaries, embrace those engineers, landscape, interior, and art, and other disciplines that are relevant for the project, and embrace them and engage them right from the first day or the first communication on the project. And that in itself has ended up many, many times becoming the influential factors in our design response. So this is something that we have felt in. It's probably an engagement with society at another level to what I was explaining, the same commonality which the firm or Mr. Kukreja has had about, creating an institution for architectural learning, such as the Sushant School, or the magazines such as the A+D or Indian Interiors magazine. All those endeavors have always been that we feel that we need to dissolve the boundary between architects and society. So the same philosophy still remains in the office today in our contemporary times, and it has been put into practice by what I just explained about creating a far greater multi and interdisciplinary approach to what one is setting out to create in terms of a building or an urban environment.
Thank you. Because I think the kind of preparedness, on dealing or addressing definitely a more complex context, versus, I'm not saying it was a simpler context in the 70s, but by virtue of the pace of the manner in which designs were made, or a building was, or a project was constructed, I think in contemporary times, that kind of space may not always be available, to, and especially to the larger practices. Coming to that, and maybe we could kind of culminate with this in a certain way. How do, because a practice like CPK would naturally have to have a certain level of preparedness. It's not only responding to a client coming in. There's an internal sense of preparedness, or for a practice of that nature to kind of grow, sustain. So how does CPK kind of, because the pandemic has been an inflection in history like never before. It's a very deep inflection. And so we are probably still trying to, in hindsight, look at what this pandemic was about, what are the changes that are happening. So how would a practice like yours intuit, because this is more speculative, and how would it intuit or speculate? There's climate change, there's rapid technological change that we're seeing, there is social change, we're discussing migration, we're discussing social distancing, a new form of urbanity. So these are factors which are directly impacting the practice of architecture. One, because of the inhabitation of social space or the building, or because it deals with physicality now. So how would the practice and also the impending climate change that everybody's discussing, how would the practice of CPK attempt to reinforce itself with a certain preparedness for this kind of a very open? The future was always uncertain, but it probably sounds more uncertain in our times now. There's an often statement made that the future today is no more what it used to be, and I think, how does a practice like CPK, with its complexity, its size, the nature of projects, kind of try to consolidate in such a unpredictable moment? Would it be possible to share some kind of speculations on this? Because there are several young practices and others who've joined in, and I think if you could share some aspects of this nature of preparedness, because eventually it's about a certain professional benchmark,
Yes.
a certain commitment and a responsibility that all practices have, which really reflect on the need for this preparedness. So if you could share your point of view on this, we would be happy.
Of course. It's a very good question, very pertinent question. Because if we see whatever is going on around us, I mean, the amount of uncertainty that exists in every aspect, and pandemic being one of the major contributors, but not the only contributor, I think one aspect which are firm, and another interesting aspect before I continue on this thought process, I want to share is that I've heard sometimes people come up to me and say that, oh, your firm, CP Kukreja Architects, is a very old firm, isn't it? It's been around forever. It's an old firm. Now, old firm, I take it where, I actually sort of laugh about it, because how do you define as old? I mean, there are institutions we know that have existed for centuries, 300 years, 200 years. So this is all how you play it in your mind. For me, one of the aspects about these uncertain times is that I always discuss this with my team, that one of the constants that we can anchor ourselves to is change. In my opinion, change is actually the only constant. And if you are willing to adapt yourself, if you're willing to change yourself rather than resisting what goes on around you, I think you are already surfing the waves, and that will take you forward. And that is the kind of culture this old institution or firm of 50 years has nurtured and continues to do so. So even the way we go about designing, I have always believed, and our leadership team fortunately also has that same philosophy and that same thought process, that our experience works only up to a certain level. And if we are wanting to innovate, if we want to do something new, we must be as welcoming to new ideas as we can to our own convictions or experiences. So even when I go about designing, I never start a project with preconceived notions. And for me, before the first sketch can emerge, it is about engaging with the young minds. And even if it is an intern in our office or the youngest architect who comes into our office, their voice, their opinions are as important as somebody who could have decades of experience. That's the way our office works. So the studios are always thriving with energy. I mean, there are people who remark, who visit this office and say, there is so much energy in this place. It's like a live wire. And I feel great about it because that's the kind of environment we want to create. So even the youngest minds here, and we always encourage young students or young architects to come and be part of this journey, because with them is only where you can, learn new things. And that is how the office sort of works. That's the philosophy of this office. And therefore, when that's the kind of culture or environment you are able to create and sustain, uncertain times don't become uncertain anymore. In fact, you thrive on that uncertainty because it's not something that starts intimidating you. It just becomes part and parcel of the environment in which you are. And I'm very happy that our studio has not only been able to sustain that kind of a thought process, but we have actually now leapt forward. So much as tragedy has struck many, many homes around and close families around us due to the pandemic, but as a studio, as a work practice, we have really been able to move ahead in a very, very positive manner in terms of the kind of projects we are engaged in.
Thank you. Thank you, Architect Kukreja, for that presentation and the dialogue that has ensued. And I look forward to, I think the book is launched by Rowley Books, and it is probably in several universities. And I think just the fact that one can discourse practices that have spanned 50 years or have spanned various nuances of history of architecture itself, from a socialist phase to the 90s to now. And I think a very challenging but interesting future, that we see unfolding in front of us. So thank you again for being here. And I have to thank also the council for supporting this dialogue, and they've been supporting it for the last 2 years, and I think it's going to continue. So I have to thank again, place on record the thanks to Architect President Habib Khan and the council, and thank you, Architect Kukreja, for this. If you would like to sum up in some way, and then we could close.
Sure. I wish to thank you as well for such an engaging conversation and this opportunity to be able to share the thoughts and ideas behind the book, as well as some glimpses of the journey which we have sort of traveled in the last 5 decades. I would also like to put my words of appreciation on record to the Council of Architecture. I think it's a fantastic endeavor. And in this new world where virtual world seems to be all encompassing, I think it's a great tool that has been embraced by the Council to reach out to the students of architecture, students of design, and the fraternity, both the entire design fraternity, architectural, engineers, and other diverse fields, to be able to engage with us architects and our profession so that we can understand each other even better and carry on this journey. And as I would love to see India making an even more global, stronger impact globally than we have done so far. So I look forward to that, and I look forward to engaging with our fraternity on many more occasions. Thank you.
Thank you. So we look forward to a further talk sometime later. Thank you. We'll close.